Imagine you are 3 weeks behind on rent, eating toast for dinner, and refreshing a job application inbox that has not produced a single response. Then the mailbox beside your apartment door, the old metal kind that sticks when it rains, produces a letter that has no business existing. Thick cream paper, a burgundy wax seal. Your full legal name, written in careful fountain pen as though it were the only name in the world. What would you do? Would you throw it away, assuming it was some elaborate scam, or would you let that envelope turn your entire life inside out? Moira Callahan chose to open it, and nothing after that was ever ordinary again. In October of 2023, Moira Callahan, 29 years old, was surviving in Winnipeg the way a lot of people survive, quietly and by pretending things were under control. She had a bookkeeping certificate, a tidy spreadsheet habit, and a one-bedroom apartment on Selkirk Avenue in the city's north end that she'd rented for 4 years. 3 weeks earlier, the restaurant that employed her had padlocked its doors on a Friday afternoon, without warning, without severance, without so much as a phone call. She had filed for EI the same day. She had been refreshing her inbox every morning since. She had nobody to call for help. Her mother had passed away from cancer when Moira was 22. Her father had never been reliably present, even before that. Her one living grandparent, her mother's father, a man named Abel, had died in a federal penitentiary in 1984, 3 years after his release on a conviction the family never discussed. That particular wound had been pressed under silence across enough generations that Moira had stopped asking questions about it long before she was old enough to ask them properly. So when the thick envelope arrived in her mailbox on a cold Wednesday morning in November, Moira stood in the hallway of her building in her socks and read her own name 3 times before she accepted that it was real. The return address read, Donald Pierce, barrister and solicitor, Portage-la-Prairie, Manitoba. She had never known anyone in Portage-la-Prairie. She opened it anyway. Inside was a formal letter requesting her immediate presence at the Pierce Law Office to discuss the estate of the late Millicent Strand. The name meant nothing to her. She had never heard of a Millicent Strand, had no connection to anyone in that part of the province. The letter was precise and careful, noting only that the matter was of significant benefit to Miss Callahan and urging her not to delay. 6 days later, Moira was sitting across from Donald Pierce, 63, in a small office on Saskatchewan Avenue that smelled of old paper and radiator warmth. Pierce had the look of a man who had spent decades delivering news to people who weren't ready for it. He folded his hands on the desk and began. Millicent Strand passed away 7 weeks ago at the age of 88, he said. She was the owner of Strand Hollow Farm, 120 acres of mixed agricultural land outside Neepawa, including the original farmhouse and a grain elevator that dates to 1938. According to her last will and testament, she has left the entire estate, land, buildings, equipment, and remaining assets, to you. Moira's first instinct was to laugh. She didn't. There must be a mistake. I have no connection to anyone named Strand. My family is from Winnipeg. Pierce slid a folder across the desk. Mrs. Strand was very specific. She provided your mother's maiden name, your maternal grandfather's full name, and your current address. There is no error. He paused, lining the folder's edge with the edge of the desk. However, the inheritance carries a condition. Moira felt something tighten behind her ribs. What kind of condition? Mrs. Strand required that before the deed is formally transferred to your name, you must take physical possession of the property and remain on site for 21 consecutive days. Should you vacate for more than 12 hours at any point during that period, the estate defaults in full to the Neepawa Agricultural Heritage Society. Pierce looked at her steadily. I should also tell you that the farmhouse has been unoccupied for approximately 15 years. Mrs. Strand moved to a care facility in 2008 and did not return. A neighboring farmer has maintained the property minimally, but the house itself is in considerable disrepair. Moira stared at the folder. She was 3 weeks behind on rent. Her checking account contained $47. "Where do I sign?" she said. She drove west out of Winnipeg 11 days later, her car packed with a duffel bag, a sleeping bag rated for -20, 3 cases of canned goods, and the specific composure of a person who has decided not to think too carefully about what they are doing until it is already done. The prairies opened up around her as soon as she cleared the city, flat and immense, the sky enormous and low with the particular grey of a Manitoba November that promises snow before it is done with you. Neepawa was a town that had once called itself the Land of Plenty. Strand Hollow Farm was a further 20 minutes beyond it, down a gravel road that the map app on her phone refused to acknowledge. She followed the written directions Pierce had provided, turning off the paved highway onto a track that wound between empty harvested fields. The crops had been taken weeks ago, leaving behind pale stubble that caught the last of the afternoon light. At the end of the track, marked by 2 weathered fence posts with a rusted chain hung between them, lay the farm. The farmhouse was a 2-story structure that had been white once. Now it was the color of weathered bone, with a shutter hanging askew from an upper window and a porch whose floorboards visibly bowed under their own weight. Behind it, rising against the flat horizon like the only vertical thing for kilometers, stood the grain elevator. A tall wooden structure in faded red, its cupola still intact. A remnant of the era when every prairie town of any size had one anchoring its skyline. The elevator was massive. It loomed over the farmhouse the way a cathedral looms over a village square, as though it had always been the real structure, and the house merely something that had grown up in its considerable shadow. Moira cut the engine. The silence of the open prairie hit her like a physical force, not peaceful, not restful, just absolute. The wind moved through the dead grass and made almost no sound. You'll want to watch the ground on the south side of that elevator. Moira startled so badly she dropped her keys. She found a man standing near the barn, watching her with the patient, assessing stillness of someone who had spent most of his life working outdoors. He was in his early 70s, with a broad frame and deliberate movements, wearing canvas work pants and a plaid-lined vest that had survived many Manitoba winters without complaint. "Hector Voss," he said. He did not extend his hand. "I farm the quarter section to the east. Millicent asked me to keep an eye on things after she moved to the home. I mow the grass, check the furnace." He paused, studying Moira with neither hostility nor warmth, just careful attention. She never mentioned any family. "I'm not family," Moira said, grabbing her duffel from the trunk. "I'm the new owner." Hector looked at her the way farmers look at uncertain weather, measuring, not unkind. "South wall of the elevator shifts in a hard frost," he said finally. "Don't stand close to it until there's a thaw." He turned toward the road. "There's a propane furnace. Pilot needs relighting manually. Generators in the shed around back if the power trips." He kept walking. "Lock the doors at night," he added without turning. "This isn't Winnipeg, and this property, it has a history that didn't get finished." Moira opened her mouth to ask him what that meant, but Hector had already rounded the corner of the barn, and the only thing moving was the dead grass in the cold wind. The first 4 days at Strand Hollow Farm were a study in controlled fear. The house was cold despite the propane furnace, its walls holding the particular damp of a building that had been empty too long. The wallpaper in the hallway was lifting at every seam. The kitchen linoleum had cracked and darkened in patterns that looked almost deliberate. There was no internet and no cell signal indoors. She had to stand on the porch with her arm extended to get a single bar, and even then it dropped every third sentence. The sounds were the worst. Old houses settle and groan as temperatures drop, and this one had had 15 years to develop its particular vocabulary of creaks. But what Moira heard at night were different, rhythmic, emanating not from the walls but from outside, from the direction of the grain elevator. On her 5th morning, she decided to stop letting the sounds live in her imagination and start making herself useful. She was going to own this property. She needed to know what was on it. The elevator's loading door was padlocked with a heavy steel shackle. She found the key on a hook in the kitchen, labeled in faded masking tape, "Elevator, Main." The interior smelled of old grain, machine oil, and cold wood. The main floor held original receiving equipment, a scale platform, a grain auger, pulleys and cables running upward into the dimness. A steep wooden ladder was bolted to the interior wall, disappearing into the upper floors. What caught her eye was the floor itself. Most of the ground level was open industrial concrete, with embedded floor drains. But in the northeast corner, partly concealed behind a rusted grain separator that must have weighed 300 kilograms, there was a wooden trapdoor. She found a crowbar in the equipment room. It took 40 minutes to shift the grain separator enough to clear it. The lock on the trapdoor was different from all the others on the property. A brass padlock, much newer, installed with the deliberate care of someone who had added it specifically and recently, as though it were protecting something rather than simply securing it. She broke it with the crowbar. The space beneath was not a root cellar. It was a finished room, insulated walls, a bare bulb on a pull chain that still worked, a wooden workbench built along one side. It smelled of cedar and something faintly chemical, like old developing fluid or the inside of a vintage camera case. The workbench held two things: a green-painted steel filing cabinet, old and unlocked, and a cedar crate lined with oilcloth, on top of which sat a manila envelope and a framed photograph. Moira picked up the photograph first. It showed two men and a woman standing in front of this grain elevator. She recognized the shape of the cupola immediately. The photograph was black and white, probably from the early 1970s, based on the cut of the clothing. One of the men was broad-shouldered, square-jawed, standing with the ease of someone accustomed to being the center of a room. The woman stood slightly behind him, her posture careful and very still. The other man was lean and younger, with an open, somewhat tired smile, the smile of a person who worked hard and tried to stay cheerful about it. She turned the photograph over in neat block letters on the back. Edwin, Millicent, Abel C. Co-op annual meeting, September 1971. Abel C. Abel Callahan. Moira sat down on the concrete floor of that underground room and looked at her grandfather's face for a very long time. She had been told almost nothing about Abel Callahan. What she knew had been assembled from half-sentences and deliberate silences over the years, that he had been a bookkeeper, that he had gone to prison when her mother was a child, that he had never really come home. The family had buried the topic so completely that Moira had stopped asking questions by the time she was 12, the way children learn to stop asking about the things that make adults go quiet. What she had not known, what no one in her family had ever known, was that Abel Callahan had spent 9 years as the bookkeeper for the local grain cooperative, a position he had taken with genuine pride in work that mattered to a farming community. Or that in 1973 he had been charged, tried and convicted of embezzling $180,000 from that cooperative's collective operating fund. Or that he had maintained his innocence until his death in a federal penitentiary in 1984. She learned all of this from the filing cabinet. Millicent Strand had spent years assembling the documentation carefully, the way someone assembles a thing they know they will never have the courage to use, but cannot bring themselves to destroy. There were original co-op ledgers, annotated in 2 distinct hands. One set of additions clearly forced into the columns in a cramped, hurried script that bore no resemblance to the careful bookkeeping surrounding it. There were bank transfer records that aligned with no co-op business Moira could identify, and there was a letter, handwritten by Edwin Strand to Millicent in the autumn of 1979, confessional in tone with the faint self-congratulation of a man who considers his own cleverness proof of his superiority, detailing in specific and exact terms how he had moved $180 Zinderone from the cooperative's accounts into a series of personal holdings, how he had planted altered records in Abel Callahan's working files, and how he had provided the RCMP with the evidence that put an innocent man in prison. He was convenient, Edwin had written. Quiet type, trusting, no real family to speak up for him, the perfect bookkeeper in both directions. Beneath the oilcloth in the cedar crate was a cash box. Inside it was $6,200 in 50s and 20s. Money Edwin had sequestered and then never touched, that Millicent had kept because she hadn't known what else to do with it, that had been sitting in this room for decades, waiting for something Millicent had perhaps hoped would eventually come. Moira was still sitting on the cold concrete floor, her hands trembling around the letter, when she heard the sound of a vehicle on the gravel outside. She climbed the ladder, crossed the main floor, and looked through the small, dusty window of the loading door. A grey SUV was parked beside her car, and a man in an expensive down vest was walking toward the farmhouse with the comfortable stride of someone who has already decided how a conversation will end. She went to meet him. Moira Callahan. The man smiled the way people smile when they want something and have chosen to try pleasant first. He was in his mid-40s, clean-shaven, with the look of someone who spent money carefully in order to appear effortless. "I'm Grant Strand. Millicent was my aunt." He tilted his head. "I heard the property had been left to a stranger. I came to see if we could resolve this sensibly before lawyers make it complicated for everyone." "Your aunt was very specific," Moira said, keeping most of the door between them. Her solicitor was clear about that. "My aunt was 88 years old and spent her last 15 years in a memory care facility." Grant's smile remained in place, but something moved behind it, something careful and cold. "I'm not looking for a legal fight. I'm looking to be fair." He produced a folded check from inside his vest. $300,000. "You sign a transfer agreement tonight, drive back to Winnipeg in the morning, and you don't have to spend another 3 weeks in this freezing wreck of a farmhouse waiting out a dead woman's eccentricity. $300,000, Moira. That's years of your life, handed to you. No contest, no complications." Moira looked at the check. Her brain, without her permission, began calculating automatically rent, debt, the number of years that would erase everything currently pressing on her. The photograph of Abel Callahan was still sitting on the workbench below the elevator floor. "Why do you want it?" she asked. "The house is falling apart. The elevator isn't operational. There's nothing here worth $300,000 on the open market." Grant's expression shifted, just briefly, just at the corners before reassembling itself. Sentimental value. This land has been in the Strand family for 80 years. "Your uncle embezzled money from a grain cooperative," Moira said quietly, "and he framed my grandfather for it." The smile disappeared completely. "I don't know what you think you've found," Grant said, his voice now precise and very flat. "But whatever documentation may exist from that period would be incomplete, potentially out of context, and almost certainly inadmissible. I would strongly advise against doing anything rash." He put the check back in his vest pocket. "Think about it overnight. I'll contact the lawyer in the morning." He walked back to the SUV and drove off without looking back. Moira stood on the porch until the sound of the engine had been absorbed completely by the open prairie. Then she went inside, sat at the kitchen's table, and thought with considerable care about what Grant had communicated with his eyes, while his mouth said something measured and reasonable. He had not driven out here to offer fair market value for a forgotten farm. He had come because he already knew what was in that elevator. He had known, probably for years, possibly since before Millicent moved to the care home, that something was being kept on this property. He had been waiting for an opportunity to access the farm without witnesses, without a legitimate owner in residence. The only reason he had offered money rather than something worse was that Moira was still here, still present, still a problem he had to negotiate around. She tried to reach Hector from the porch, one bar then none. She moved into the yard, found a single bar, dialed, and got silence. At 2 in the morning, she woke to the sound of a vehicle on the gravel with no headlights. She was moving before she was fully conscious. She pulled on her boots and jacket in the dark and went to the window. In the deep blue of a prairie night under thick cloud cover, Grant's SUV sat at the edge of the driveway. Two figures were getting out, Grant and someone broader and shorter, who moved with the careful, unhurried deliberation of a person who was being paid for it. She had perhaps 3 minutes before they reached the farmhouse door. Moira went out the kitchen door and ran, not for the road, not for Hector's lights on the eastern horizon, but for the grain elevator. The main door was still unlocked from her afternoon inside it. She pulled it shut behind her and stood in the absolute dark, listening. Footsteps crossed the yard. A beam of light swept the window. Grant's voice, flat and unhurried. "Check the house first. She may still be inside." Moira had spent 6 days in this elevator. She knew it the way you know a space when you have moved through it carefully and alone, where the floor held firm, where it gave, what sounds it made. She knew that the wooden interior ladder was quiet if you pressed your hands and feet to the outer edges of the rungs, where the wood was most compressed. She knew that the upper drying floor, the second story, had a ventilation hatch on its north face. A narrow exterior opening she had noticed was unlatched and had filed away as something she should fix when she got around to it. She climbed. In pitch dark, hand over hand, counting rungs, 16 to the second level. She stepped off onto the upper floor and moved carefully across the timber, testing each board with her weight before trusting it. The exterior hatch was where she remembered. She unlatched it and pushed it out into the freezing night air. The exterior maintenance ladder, old iron, bolted to the north face for roof access, was 2 meters to her left. She would have to traverse the side of the building to reach it. Below her she heard the elevator's main door open. Moira went out the hatch. She pressed her back against the cold wooden siding and moved sideways along the narrow maintenance ledge. A timber beam wide enough for one boot placed carefully ahead of the other. The wind off the open prairie cut straight through her jacket. She did not look down. She counted her steps instead, feeling for the iron of the ladder with her outstretched hand. 1, 2, 3. Her fingers found it. She gripped it hard and climbed down, rung by rung, until her boots touched the frozen ground on the north side of the elevator, around the corner from where either man had gone. She could hear them inside, moving across the maiden floor. One of them said her name, flatly without urgency, in the tone of someone who is not calling out to connect, but simply to locate. She ran north through the field, through the frozen stubble that crunched under her boots, toward the faint line of yard lights she knew was Hector Voss's farm, 3/4 of a kilometer to the east. She ran without looking back. She found Hector's truck unlocked in his yard, farm habit, the key behind the visor. She climbed in and pressed the horn in 3 long blasts until a light came on in the farmhouse window, and then a second and then the porch. It took 22 minutes at highway speed before her phone produced enough signal to dial 911. She pulled over on the paved road and sat with the heater running while she explained to the dispatcher, clearly and in order, what she had found and who was currently on her property. The RCMP arrived within 40 minutes. Grant Strand and the man he'd brought with him. A private investigator from Winnipeg who had, it quickly became apparent, made a significant professional error in agreeing to accompany a client onto private property at 2 in the morning, was still inside the grain elevator when the officers arrived. Grant was arrested. The investigator cooperated immediately and at considerable length. The documentation Millicent had preserved in the subfloor room was turned over to the RCMP and subsequently to the Provincial Cold Case Review Unit. The original co-op ledgers, Edwin Strand's letter of confession, and the bank transfer records were sufficient. Following forensic analysis and corroborating testimony from elderly former cooperative members, to confirm what Millicent Strand had known for decades and had been too afraid of Edwin to act upon while he was alive. That Abel Callahan had been innocent of every charge leveled against him. A formal statement was issued 8 months later. It arrived too late for Abel himself, who had been dead for nearly 40 years. It arrived too late for Frances Callahan, his wife, who had spent the rest of her life under the specific weight of being the family of someone the world believed guilty. But it was not too late for Moira, who stood in Pierce's office on a bright spring morning and read her grandfather's name being cleared in formal language, and felt something she had not anticipated. Not triumph exactly, but a loosening, as though something wound very tight inside her family across many generations had finally slowly been allowed to come undone. She completed her 21 days at Strand Hollow Farm. Then she completed another 21, and then another. A Manitoba spring arrived with its usual reluctance, pale-skied and fitful, warming in small increments, and Moira found herself in rubber boots in the East Field, talking with Hector about what the land had once produced and what it might be coaxed into producing again. The finder's fee she received, along with a provincial heritage grant connected to the historical significance of the co-op documentation, was enough to begin. She hired a Neepawa contractor to stabilize the farmhouse roof before the next winter came. She commissioned a heritage assessment of the grain elevator, which was confirmed as one of the few remaining original wooden elevators of its age in western Manitoba. The Neepawa Agricultural Heritage Society, which had stood to inherit the farm if Moira had ever left, became instead her partner in preserving the structure as a functioning historical landmark, funded in part by a quiet settlement the Strand estate made under legal pressure, without admission into a community trust. Hector brought his grandchildren to the farm in August to see the first small harvest from the East Field. It was not enough to matter commercially. It was enough to matter in the way that first things matter. Moira put a photograph on the kitchen windowsill. Abel Callahan, September 1971, standing in front of the elevator that had held his name in the dark for 60 years, smiling the tired, open smile of a man who worked hard and tried to stay cheerful about it. She was not entirely home yet, not fully, not in the way that takes more than a single season, but she was closer than she had ever been to understanding what the word might mean for her. Moira Callahan had driven to a frozen prairie farm, expecting 21 days of obligation and a fast exit. She found her grandfather instead. Now it's your turn. Would you have opened that envelope? And if you'd been standing in that underground room with the evidence in your hands, and Grant Strand's check still warm in your memory, would you have taken the $300,000 and driven away? Or would you have stayed? Leave your answer in the comments. We read everyone. If this story reached you, give it a like and share it with someone who believes the truth has a way of surviving whatever you bury it under. Subscribe to Claim the Drama for more stories about ordinary people and the moments that ask everything of them.